All right, let's do Control-Alt-Shift-E again to get a nice new flattened layer so that I can demonstrate the next piece of this puzzle. If we come over to Filter and Sharpen, we can use Unsharpen Mask to create some weird effects. Instead of just using it to sharpen something up, if you just crank it to insane amounts, you can produce some really interesting results that you may not expect otherwise. And this is actually something that's fun to do. Something that's fun to do with a lot of these filters. Come in even to something that you're familiar with and play with each slider individually to see what happens if you crank it all the way in one direction or another. Then try combinations of sliders just so that you can see what happens. So at a low threshold, a high amount, and relatively high pixel radius, you get some really insane effects. Now, if you don't want that to be permanent, you can, of course, convert this to a smart object, and then you can do your filter, and you can do your sharpen and your unsharpen mask. And now, voila, you can do some crazy things. Let's kick down this threshold level. All right. Well, that seemed to work pretty well. So the unsharpened mask, the amount is the intensity of the effect. So if we go in and do another unsharpened mask on top of it, dare we? Sharpen, unsharpened mask. So the amount, wow, look at that. The amount is the intensity of the effect. The radius is the size of the sharpening halos to be added to the image. And the threshold determines the amount of the contrast. So higher threshold means more contrast, or vice versa. Lower zero levels of threshold will result in some pretty high contrast. Zero means that there won't be any. Sorry, I wrote this down. Zero means that any contrast difference in the image at all will be enhanced. There we go. So it's looking for the number of thresholds, the threshold difference on it. So a certain number of levels means a certain pixel value between it. So in this case, at 1, there has to be a change between essentially one value in color. So if you had white and then not quite white, that would do it. At 100, you would have to have the difference between, say, white and then gray at of 100 value. So let me show you instead of just gabbling. All right, so here we go. This would be white 255. If you had 100, it would pick all the colors between 155 and 0. Sorry, all of the tones between 155 and 0 on each of the channels. If you had 200, then it would essentially bounce around, except I've got that backwards because it actually starts at 0. So 0 would get, sorry about that, one more try. 0 means everything above it would be selected, all of these grays, and just pay attention to this bar. 155 would mean everything from 155, if I can get up there, 155, here we are, 155, all the way up to white. So essentially this gray all the way up. That's essentially what it means. So if you crank it all the way over, then it will have an effect. And I want to say it is by that ratio, but let me double check. Filter, sharpen, one more unsharpen mask. Threshold levels do in fact go to 255. So 0 and up will cover everything on all the channels. Higher will cover only some of it. So we can get some pretty crazy effects. But now that we've got all these crazy effects, maybe we've gone too crazy? Is that possible? Is it time to add a blur? Let's try some of those. So if we come over to blur, we can have, for example, something simple like a Gaussian blur, which would just blur everything out, which is perhaps not what we want. Or we could have something a little more interesting known as surface blur. So this this tries to figure out what a surface of an object is based off the strength of the threshold between it. So in other words, it would say that all of this stuff connected would be one shape, but these things, since it's a sudden change in color and tonality, would be different. And how does it know? Well, we use threshold again. And the amount of the blur is just the radius here. So we'll crank that up. And we'll do a surface blur. And we'll see it. Notice that it's is in fact trying to figure out and separate this. Now there isn't any actual surface here because we've generated all of this. So it's just kind of doing a best guess towards it. But honestly, I think it had a pretty good effect. So surface blur can be pretty good for things like flowers. If you want to keep the structure of the flower's petals while at the same time having the internals blurred out. Let me show you. Okay, so here's a rose. If we go to Filter, Blur, Surface Blur, kick the threshold down a bit, it will try to keep the shape of the individual petals, and we can spin around until we find those, and then you can blur out inside of those shapes. So the surface blur can be a great way to reduce overall textures that are starting to occur inside of your image. So I think that's a pretty important one. But you can see that it also can be fun to play around with on actual photographs. Let's wait for this to render out. There we go. And you can see this stylized effect. Now, that said, it can be very useful to actually fade these on. Let me convert this to a smart object real quick and do a filter surface blur. And we'll just use the same settings. Let me use some movie magic. And voila, we've got that spread out. Now that's on a smart filter, we can just double click the blending options. It may have been faster to actually just duplicate this simply because of the amount of time that it takes to do the non-destructive edits. So do watch out for that. From time to time, a filter will be so intense that you need to actually do it destructively on duplicates, just so you don't have to recalculate everything every time. So in fact, let me hit cancel here. We'll do exactly that. Control-Alt-Shift-E. Will Control-Alt-Shift-E. I say Control-Alt, oh, there's no layer above it. Control-Alt-Shift-E. I hit X instead. Control-Alt-Shift-E will create a duplicate. Let me pop into this smart object real quick. Control-A, Control-C. Come back here, Control-V. So we've got the original and we've got the blurred one. All right. Now we'll go ahead and do something like overlay. And let me show you the original. Sorry, the original on normal and overlay. Look at that. And you could just knock down the opacity. You could get some beautiful effects in real photography with surface blur. All right, but it's also a fantastic way to come in here and break down some of these things so that you get blurred out areas inside of it. Notice we're starting to get some colors that are out of control, so we'll need to visit that eventually. So let's move on to a few more filters that you could find useful though. I will see you in the next video.